Welcome back to Face the Nation. Joining us now is the Mexican ambassador to the United States, Martha Bárcena Coqui. She was part of the Mexican negotiating team working to prevent the Trump administration from imposing tariffs on Mexico. Good to have you here. Your president held a rally in Tijuana last night, but President Trump tweeted this morning that tariffs aren't totally off the table. Is it too soon to celebrate?
Good morning, Margaret. I'm really thrilled to be here in Face the Nation. And yes, we were following the rally yesterday at Tijuana with the saying, Mexico United is stronger, and we want friendship and dialogue with the United States. So the idea of the rally was to inform the declaration that we agreed to, and saying we avoided the imposition of tariffs, and we want to continue to work with the U.S. very closely on the different challenges that we have together. And one urgent one at this moment is immigration.
Mm-hmm. And this is just a declaration of principles. This isn't a signed agreement.
It's a joint declaration of principles, which is the base that gives us the base for the roadmap that we have to follow in the incoming months on immigration and cooperation on asylum issues and development in Central America.
So in 90 days, negotiators will reconvene, according to this announcement. There's a 90-day timeline. How quickly does your country think that you will see a drop-off in these migrants?
We will deploy the National Guard from Monday. I want to explain that this deployment will take place now because until 2 weeks ago, we were still discussing the laws to implement the National Guard. So the deployment throughout the country has already begun, and it will increase next Monday. So we will see how the results of the deployment of the National Guard, which, by the way, is not similar to the National Guard of the U.S., it is not like the National Guard of the U.S. It is a police force based on the models of the European military police, like the Carabinieri, like the Gendarmerie, like the Guardia Civil Española. So we have to understand that. When people talk about deployment of troops, they are wrong. What we are deploying is a police force, and we are deploying it to put order in the borders. So we would hope that this will bring results in a very relative short term, like in a month or a month and a half.
Well, for the past 3 months, there have been more than 100,000 migrants crossing the U.S. border. Last month alone, 132,000 apprehensions. That was up 30%. Did the Trump administration give you hard numbers, say we need to see a 30% decrease before we go back to putting a tariff threat on the table?
No, what we talked was that the numbers have to go down like to previous levels that we had maybe last year or in 2018. What we are seeing is that this surge of migrants really was totally unexpected, both for Mexico and for the U.S. If you think that almost 1% of the Honduran population has left the country in the last 5 months, and the same for Guatemala, then you have to realize that we are really in front of a humanitarian tragedy. And that is why we need to address the humanitarian tragedy with the elements that were put on in the declaration: the enforcement search and enforcement of Mexican migratory laws, the expansion of the MPP. Then we will continue to have technical talks almost weekly, and then to evaluate constantly what is going on in these 90 days. And then the commitment to cooperate with Central American countries for their development and prosperity.
So it sounds like there are a lot of details that will still be worked out on how this is actually going to work. What are some of these side agreements that the president is tweeting about?
I think there are a lot of the details that we discussed during the negotiations and during the conversations that we didn't put in the declaration, because this is different paths that we are to follow. Let's say we even discuss at a certain time how to put more emphasis in the rural areas of Central America, where 60% of the migrants are coming from. So, and we have been putting more effort on security and good governance and training police, but very little in the rural areas. So this is the kind of things that we will continue to work.
Very quickly, though, was there any kind of agreement by your government to buy agricultural products?
It is our understanding that without tariffs and with USMCA ratification, there will be an increased rates both in agricultural products and manufactured products.
But even nothing that was actually agreed to as part of this negotiation, because the president's been tweeting saying that Mexico agreed to buy all sorts of agricultural products.
What I would say is that even now, we are the second buyer of the U.S. in grains and meat and this. We have an integrated economy in the agricultural sector.
Of course.
We export fruit and vegetables to the U.S., also contributing to a healthier diet in the U.S., and we buy basically grains and meat. So the trends are already there. So what we are expecting without the tariffs is an increase. You have to remember that until last year, we were the third trade partner. We are now the first. So we are your most important market, and you are our most important market. Is trade on agricultural products going to grow? Yes, it is going to grow, and it is going to grow without tariffs and with USMCA ratification.
But there was no transaction that was signed off on as part of this deal, is what I understand you're saying. You're just talking about trade.
I'm talking about trade, and I am absolutely certain that the trade in agricultural goods could increase dramatically in the next few months.
All right. Ambassador, thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much,
tracking
Margaret.
to see how those negotiations continue to go. We'll be right back with our political panel. It's time now for some analysis from our political panel. Mark Landler is a White House correspondent at the New York Times and soon-to-be London bureau chief. Karen Tumulty is a columnist covering national politics at the Washington Post. David Nakamura is also at the Post, and he covers the White House. And Kelsey Snell is a congressional reporter for NPR. Good to have you all here. Mark, let's pick up where we just left off with the ambassador. It sounds like there's no signed agreement. There are a lot of details that still need to be figured out here. But the president has declared victory in avoiding the tariffs he threatened to put on Mexico.
That's right. And it's a pattern we've seen repeatedly with this president. He sort of creates a crisis, has some sort of a fairly general resolution to it that's lacking any details, and then declares victory. This is what he did with the North Korea nuclear crisis in Singapore. In this particular situation, there's some very important sort of unresolved business, the most important of which I think is this concept of third safe country. The United States wanted Mexico to agree to this. The Mexicans have not, in part because doing so would require them to get their own Senate to ratify this measure. And I think there's a great deal of concern in Mexico that announcing something like this before it's ratified would lead to a renewed surge in migrants. So there are key parts of this that are unresolved, but you have to say from an economic point of view, from the market's point of view, from the potential impact on the economy, he's stepped back from the brink. I think he'll probably be rewarded with a very strong market opening tomorrow morning. And in some sense, he's right. He has resolved, for the moment, the sense of crisis. He hasn't resolved the problem longer term.
And Karen, we had a Republican senator who had been concerned about the president's threat, praising this brinksmanship. Does this in some way empower the president to defy his party and continue to use tariffs as his chief tool negotiating?
Well, certainly everything with this administration ends up being defined as an economic question. And it will be interesting to see if there's anything that comes along that what the ambassador said that was so striking is that, you know, that the countries that are sending, Honduras, Guatemala, have each lost 1% of their population in the last 5 months. It seems like any kind of long-term solution is going to have to deal with the factors in those countries that are driving desperate people out. And, you know, ultimately, you are not going to see the kind of reduction in numbers that the president is going to want and need unless you are dealing with what, in fact, is causing the migration.
Exactly right. We quoted former DHS Secretary Jay Johnson, the Obama administration, just this week, talking about unless you address those push factors, which takes years, you're not going to see the numbers. And he has personal experience. We saw the numbers at the borders from Central America swell under the Obama administration in 2014. We saw children being held in border patrol stations and agents trying to deal with changing diapers and feeding them. And that had a huge impact politically in the United States. There was a big response, including from the Mexican government, more enforcement. The numbers dipped the next year, but then went up even more in Obama's last year. And that pattern has happened again under Trump. We saw the lower numbers in 2017. Now they're higher than they've been in 12 years. And what you saw with the president announcing this deal is he has kept the threat of tariffs on the table. He said, I could come back in a few months, 90 days or more, come back at this again if Mexico does not respond. And the truth will be in the numbers at the end of each month, where you could see a dip, but it could go back up.
And that general agreement, the declaration we saw, Kelsey, did mention support for these Central American countries, but there were no specifics. You had Senator Blunt say, I support more foreign aid, but does Congress actually do anything to back up what the president essentially promised to do?
Well, the problem with Congress is they have traditionally shown that they cannot get immigration bills passed. And one of the questions that still remains out there is, what do they do about people who are coming to the border? How do they handle the people who are already coming? And what do they do about asylum seekers and the legal immigration process? All of which they haven't been able to answer in a way that actually moves the ball forward or brings them any closer to actually passing anything. And that's even further complicated by the fact that, immigration is now, because of these tariffs, become very deeply intertwined with the conversations about trade. And that's something that Congress is deeply concerned with. And there are, particularly in the House, a number of people who are very worried that if they don't get this USMCA, the trade agreement with Mexico and Canada, through, that they'll just lose all of their trading opportunities with these countries. So the two issues are now so deeply intertwined, it's hard to see how they figure it out.
And you had the ambassador gesture to that, but diplomatically acknowledged there was no deal to buy American agricultural products that the president said on Twitter there was.
That's right. And that's sort of, again, typical of President Trump. He often will sort of go a little bit further than the details in the agreement. I think it's worth pointing out one other thing, though, and this is where the intertwining of trade and immigration becomes important. There were some real warning signs late last week in the latest jobs number, in some of the financial statistics, the bond yield, that suggests that the economy is actually more fragile and more vulnerable to being hurt by tariffs, the impact of tariffs on the economy, than perhaps we thought as recently as 3-4 weeks ago. And I have to believe that entered into the president's calculus. He has to be thinking about all of this in the context of 2020. What he really has going for him has been the resilience of this economy. If that doesn't hold up, he has another much larger problem on his hands. I think that played into his thinking.
And it's interesting, Karen, when you talk to some of the 2020 candidates and you ask them about running against the Trump economy and the strength of that, they often point to the vulnerability of American farmers. But American farmers, have they shown any sign of pulling back from supporting President Trump?
They are concerned, and they are feeling the impact already of the trade wars. But in my own interviewing, and what you see too, and in other reporting, is the support does remain relatively strong for the president. And a lot of his supporters in Middle America say, okay, this is causing a little bit of short-term pain for me, but I have confidence the president has a long-term strategy out there that is ultimately going to pay off. The question is whether they will still feel that way a year from now.
And do we see any vote, by the way, on what Senator Blunt was saying is in terms of these unaccompanied children running out of money to take care of them in U.S. custody within 30 days?
No, it's very hard to see how that becomes part of the things that they need, that they pass before Congress goes out of town. I mean, they don't have much time left. They are going on break that they go on every year and at the beginning of August, and they need to get a lot of things done, like spending agreements, and they have a lot of nominations to process. The calendar is just very tight.
Very tight, and it doesn't seem like there's much momentum.
It's a big problem. I mean, the Trump's own DHS came out and said, we need this emergency funding, and we need a lot of it to deal with this crisis. This is not politics. This is a humanitarian crisis. Trump's own department said this. And if you just look back, I mentioned this before, but a similar crisis in 2014, not as big. The Obama administration put forward a similar $1 billion emergency spending proposal, supplemental to try to deal with their own crisis at the border, and was not passed. Both parties went into recess. Republicans were blocking that idea in the House. Now you have it flipped, where Republicans are saying, well, the Republican administration is saying we need the money, but there doesn't look like the political will to do anything. And that's a real problem, as these numbers, as high as they were, they could come down a little bit. They're still going to remain fairly high, though. Over time, it's going to take a while for Mexico, if they're even going to be able to do anything dramatic to bring any kind of these numbers down. So I think we're looking at a real potential problem here.
And Senator Blunt blamed Democrats for that, Kelsey. What is the issue with approving this funding to take care of these underage kids?
Well, because it always gets intertwined with the wall, and that for a lot of Democrats at this point, when the president says immigration, they hear the wall. And it's very difficult for Republicans to separate that out, because a lot of constituents, a lot of voters hear when the president says immigration, the wall, the same way Democrats do. And the longer that goes on, the more that Democrats default to having a conversation about the wall, the harder it gets for them to pass anything. And I think that if they want to get this border supplemental done, the best opportunity they have might be to combine it with some other thing that absolutely has to pass. But we know that that has its own perils.
And when is that going to happen?
It's a great question. They have to keep the government open after September 30th, and they would like to get a deal to increase spending before then. So there's a lot of moving parts at this point.
I mean, the president shut down the government for 35 days over his border wall, and the numbers continued to go up at the border. He then said, I'm going to shut down the entire border to tourism and trade. Had that threat in April, the numbers continued to go up. Now he's threatened this tariffs. The numbers are the highest ever. We don't know that any of this stuff works.
Well, what we do know is that immigration is something the president wants to talk about on the campaign trail, though Republicans would like to stay focused on the economy. The other thing that seems to be resonant on both sides is the abortion issue right now. Karen, by having this be so front and center in the 2020 race, does this hurt Democrats? Does this help Democrats?
You know, traditionally, abortion has been a voting issue primarily on the side of people who oppose abortion. It's been a top priority for them. But if you look at, the changing makeup of the Supreme Court, if you look at some of the laws that are being passed out in the states, in places like Alabama and Georgia, specifically as an effort to overturn Roe versus Wade, what you are seeing is that it is rising as a priority among Democrats. And the fervor, I think, right now is there. The fact is, public opinion on abortion has always been complicated. Going all the way back to Roe versus Wade, what you had was a plurality of people having, moral difficulties with abortion, but a small majority, a close majority of people want to see it remain legal in most of the circumstances in which it is used. This is now being tested in a way that I think is energizing Democrats.
And Mark, one of those people who's openly had a moral issue, as you put it, with abortion has been Vice President Biden, who's been very open that as a Catholic, it is problematic for him. But then we saw this, what's characterized as a flip-flop by some this week, where he now says he can no longer block federal funding of abortion.
Yeah, that's right. So Joe Biden, like many other Democrats, even though he had these sort of very ambiguous views, felt that sort of the right balance to strike was to not oppose a woman's right to abortion, but to acknowledge that federal funding shouldn't be used to pay for it. This was known as the Hyde Amendment. It passed on a bipartisan basis for many years. But what Joe Biden has discovered is he's no longer in the mainstream of his party. He's really an outlier at this point. And not only that, it's really not a sustainable position. So after initially sticking to the position via aid, saying he's not changing his view on this, he was forced to do this rather embarrassing flip-flop, which raises questions in the minds of some Democrats about the other elements of Joe Biden's very, very long legislative record. Is he going to have to flip-flop on Iraq? He's already acknowledged he regrets the Iraq vote. Is he going to have to flip-flop on the crime bill? There's a lot of things in Joe Biden's record, which is very different than many others in the field, just because of how long he's been doing this, that we may see this kind of pattern of him being forced to reckon with the positions he took.
And we'll talk about that on the other side of this as well. It's going to be a challenge in 2020. We'll be back in a moment with a look at the legacy of American leadership 75 years after D-Day. On June 6, 1944, Allied troops landed on a 50-mile stretch of French coastline, poised to fight Nazi Germany. It was the largest sea invasion in history, and it helped change the course of World War II. From that alliance grew a new world order that is being tested today. It was a rare moment of unity, comity, and reflection Thursday on the hallowed ground of Normandy, where 10,000 soldiers, more than 2,000 of them American, lost their lives in the fight for freedom.
You are among the very greatest Americans who will ever live. You are the pride of our nation. You are the glory of our republic. And we thank you from the bottom of our hearts.
It has been 75 years since D-Day, but as France's President Emmanuel Macron expressed, some debts can never be repaid.
We know what we owe to you veterans, our freedom. On behalf of my nation, I just want to say thank you.
He also thanked those veterans for, as he put it, the heritage of peace they left behind, the world order that America shaped. Out of the ashes of war, America rebuilt its broken and bankrupt allies through the Marshall Plan and even shored up its defeated enemies. The IMF and the World Bank were created to lift countries out of poverty, the United Nations to preserve world peace, and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, to guard it. Standing at Normandy in 1984, President Ronald Reagan described it as America's vow to our dead.
The strength of America's allies is vital to the United States, and the American security guarantee is essential to the continued freedom of Europe's democracies. We were with you then, we're with you now. Your hopes are our hopes, and your destiny is our destiny. Here in this place, where the West held together, let us make a vow to our dead, strengthened by their courage, heartened by their value, and born by their memory. Let us continue to stand for the ideals for which they lived and died.
Today, those ideals and values are being challenged by populist movements in Europe, causing fractures in their union, and in the U.S., where some wonder whether America still benefits from the world order it crafted. President Trump himself often calls into question America's alliances, including with those countries who fought alongside it at Normandy. But on Thursday, the tumultuous political moment we now live in seemed to pause, to remember the enormous legacy of American leadership.
The American sons and daughters who saw us to victory were no less extraordinary in peace. They built families. They built industries. They built a national culture that inspired the entire world.
Politics may no longer stop at the water's edge. Alliances may be cracked or frayed. But for a moment on Normandy's shores this week, the world celebrated again the values and veterans who continue to define American greatness. And we'll be right back. For Face the Nation, I'm Margaret Brennan.